My name is Margaret Chen, and I'm 73 years old. What happened last Christmas changed everything between me and my son David forever. I need to tell you this story because it's about more than just family drama. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it costs you everything. I was born in San Francisco's Chinatown in 1951, in a cramped 2-room apartment above my parents' laundry shop. My parents, Li Wei and Ming Chen, had immigrated from Taiwan with nothing but hope, determination, and the clothes on their backs. They'd fled the political turmoil of their homeland, carrying only a small suitcase and my mother's jade bracelet, the last remnant of her family's former prosperity. Every morning at 4 a.m., I'd wake to the sound of my father starting the industrial washing machines downstairs. The entire building would vibrate with their rhythm. My mother would already be in the kitchen, preparing steamed buns for our breakfast before beginning her 16-hour workday. They spoke broken English, but they understood the American dream with crystal clarity. Sacrifice everything so your children can have what you never could. I remember walking to school through Chinatown's narrow streets, past herb shops with mysterious dried roots hanging in windows, past elderly men playing Xiang Qi in Portsmouth Square, past the dragon mural that still watches over Grant Avenue today. Other kids sometimes made fun of my hand-sewn clothes or the way my lunch smelled different from theirs, but my parents had taught me that education was the great equalizer in America. Margaret, my mother would say in Mandarin, her hands red and cracked from years of handling harsh detergents. In America, if you study hard enough, work hard enough, you can become anything, even president. She'd laugh at this last part, but her eyes held genuine belief. I became the first person in my family to graduate high school, then UC Berkeley, then Stanford Law School. Every scholarship I won, every A on a report card, was celebrated like a national holiday in our little apartment. My parents framed my law degree and hung it in the shop window, next to faded photos of distant relatives they'd left behind in Taiwan. By the time I retired at 65, I had accumulated considerable wealth, not just from my successful civil rights practice, but from smart investments in San Francisco real estate that I'd bought when the city was still affordable. My Victorian house in Pacific Heights, purchased for $85,000 in 1978, was now worth over $3 million. I had substantial savings, retirement accounts, and a stock portfolio that had grown steadily over 4 decades of careful investing. David was my only child, born when I was 31 and finally established enough in my career to start a family. He grew up privileged in ways I never dreamed possible as a child. Private schools like Town School for Boys, summer camps in the Sierras, ski trips to Tahoe, college at Stanford without a penny of student debt. When he graduated, I gave him the down payment for his first house in Palo Alto. When he got married, I paid for the wedding at the St. Francis Hotel. He became a successful tech executive at a prominent Silicon Valley company, married his college. Sweetheart Sarah, a sweet woman from Oregon who taught elementary school before the children were born, and gave me 2 beautiful grandchildren. Emma, 12, had my mother's intelligence and curiosity, always asking probing questions about the world around her. Jake, 9, had David's athletic build, but a gentler temperament, the kind of child who brought home injured birds and worried about homeless people he saw on the street. On the surface, we seemed like the perfect American success story, the immigrant family who'd made it, whose children had achieved the prosperity their grandparents had dreamed of. But something had been bothering me about David for months before that fateful Christmas, something that made my stomach clench with worry and disappointment. He'd been making increasingly callous comments about homeless people cluttering up downtown, about immigrants taking jobs from real Americans, about people struggling financially, being lazy, or making poor choices. They should just work harder, he'd say, scrolling through his phone while sitting in his $90,000 Tesla. I made it. Why can't they? It's all about personal responsibility. It broke my heart to hear my son, the child I'd raised to believe in justice and compassion, speak this way. But I kept hoping it was just a phase, that the thoughtful boy who used to help me serve meals at soup kitchens would eventually resurface. The week before Christmas, I'd decided to volunteer at the Hamilton Family Center, a homeless shelter in the Mission District where I'd been donating my time for years. This time, I brought along Maria Santos, a 34-year-old woman I'd been helping with her asylum case. Maria had fled El Salvador with her 2 children, 7-year-old Carlos and 5-year-old Sofia, after receiving death threats from gang members who targeted her family when she refused to pay extortion money from her small convenience store. She was brilliant, had been a literature teacher back home, spoke 3 languages fluently, and could solve complex math problems in her head. But here in America, she was working 3 minimum wage jobs just to afford a single room in a boarding house in the Tenderloin while waiting for her asylum hearing. She cleaned office buildings at night, worked at a laundromat during the day, and babysat for other immigrant families on weekends, sending every spare dollar to her mother who was hiding in Honduras until it was safe to reunite. I'll tell you where this story goes next, but first, I'm curious. Where are you watching this from? Are you from the US or somewhere else in the world? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because this story is about to take some unexpected turns that will challenge everything you think you know about family, wealth, and what we owe each other. The Hamilton Family Center that December week was more overwhelmed than I'd ever seen it. San Francisco was experiencing its coldest December in 15 years, with temperatures dropping into the 30s at night, deadly weather for anyone sleeping outdoors. Every bed in the shelter was full, with families sleeping on yoga mats, in the community room, and there was a waiting list of over 50 people hoping for space if someone left. Maria and I arrived at 5 p.m. to help serve dinner. The kitchen was a symphony of controlled chaos, volunteers stirring massive pots of chili, slicing dozens of loaves of donated bread, setting up folding tables and chairs in the main hall. The air was thick with the smell of food and the sound of multiple languages: Spanish, English, Mandarin, Vietnamese, Tagalog, as families from across the globe tried to create some semblance of normalcy for their children. I watched Maria immediately spring into action, translating for other Spanish-speaking families, helping an elderly Guatemalan man fill out paperwork for disability benefits, and comforting a young mother whose toddler was crying from hunger. Despite having so little herself, she shared her own dinner portion with a pregnant teenager who'd arrived too late for the meal service. "Mrs. Chen," she told me as we cleaned up that night, stacking chairs and wiping down tables, "I know what it's like to have nothing, to feel invisible in a country where you don't speak the language perfectly, where people look at you like you're less than human. These people here, they're not lazy or looking for handouts. They're fighting battles nobody can see. The single mother working 2 jobs but still can't afford San Francisco rent because her wages haven't kept up with housing costs. The veteran with PTSD who can't hold down steady employment. The family whose breadwinner got sick and lost everything, to medical bills." Her words stuck with me as I drove home to Pacific Heights, past the gleaming windows of luxury condos and the perfectly manicured parks where I'd never seen a homeless person. Not because they didn't exist, but because they'd been systematically moved away from areas where wealthy people lived. When I arrived home, I found David and Sarah decorating our 12-foot noble fir Christmas tree with Emma and Jake. The scene was picture perfect, my son stringing lights while Sarah arranged ornaments with practiced precision, the children's laughter echoing through our spacious living room with its original hardwood floors and view of the Golden Gate Bridge. Emma ran up to hug me, her face glowing with excitement about Santa's upcoming visit, her arms still smelling like the sugar cookies they'd been decorating. Jake was carefully hanging ornaments he'd made at his private school, his tongue poking out in concentration, the same way David used to do when he was that age, methodically ensuring each decoration was perfectly spaced. "Grandma Maggie, look, at the ornament I made in art class." Emma held up a construction paper angel covered in silver glitter that immediately began falling onto my Persian rug. Mrs. Henderson said mine was the most creative in the whole 4th grade. It's absolutely beautiful, sweetheart, I said, pulling her close and breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo. Tell me about how you made it. As she launched into an elaborate explanation involving pipe cleaners, tissue paper, and considerable amounts of glue, I felt that familiar ache of love for these children who represented the best hope for our family's future. These moments with Emma and Jake were precious to me. They reminded me why family mattered so much, why we have obligations to each other and to the broader human family. David looked up from wrestling with a particularly stubborn strand of Christmas lights, his face flushed with mild frustration. "How was your day at the shelter, Mom?" he asked, but I could hear something dismissive in his tone. The same way he might ask about my book club or gardening, polite interest in something he considered a harmless hobby for elderly women. "It was good," I said carefully, testing the waters. "There are so many families there right now. Children Emma and Jake's age who don't have warm beds tonight, who are wondering if they'll have Christmas presents this year." Sarah looked up from adjusting an ornament, her expression immediately shifting to concern. "That's so heartbreaking. Is there anything we can do to help? Maybe we could organize a toy drive at Emma's school or volunteer as a family." Before I could answer, David made a dismissive snorting sound. "Sarah, those people choose to be there. There are government programs, there are job training opportunities, there are shelters and food banks. They just don't want to take advantage of them because it's easier to live off handouts than to work for what they need like we did." I felt my chest tighten with a familiar combination of disappointment and anger. "David, that's simply not true. I met families there tonight who are working multiple jobs and still can't afford rent in this city. Maria, the woman I told you about who's seeking asylum, she works 3 jobs and still can't afford a decent place for her children. Come on, Mom, you're being naive about this stuff. You've always had a soft heart, but you can't see the big picture. I started from nothing. And look where I am now. It's about making smart choices, working hard, and not expecting other people to solve your problems for you." The words hit me like a physical blow. "You did not start from nothing, David. Your grandfather worked himself to death in a laundry shop so I could go to law school. I worked 80-hour weeks for 40 years, fighting discrimination cases and defending people's civil rights, so you could go to Stanford without debt, so you could get your first job through connections I'd built, so you could buy your house with money I gave you." David waved his hand dismissively, not even looking up from the lights he was untangling. "That's different. That's family taking care of family. That's how it's supposed to work." "And what about the human family?" I asked quietly. "What about our obligation to help people who don't have what we have?" The children had stopped decorating and were watching us with worried expressions. Emma's bright smile replaced by the kind of anxious look children get when they sense adult conflict. "They don't understand." I forced a smile and suggested we finish the tree together, but David's words echoed in my mind for the rest of the evening, a bitter soundtrack to what should have been a joyful family tradition. Christmas morning started with the kind of magical chaos that only happens when grandchildren wake up at 5:30 a.m., convinced that Santa has visited and left treasures under the tree. Emma and Jake thundered down the stairs in their pajamas, their excited shrieks echoing through my Victorian house as they discovered the carefully wrapped presents I'd stayed up until midnight arranging. I'd deliberately chosen gifts that would nurture their compassion and curiosity rather than expensive gadgets. Books about different cultures and historical figures who'd fought for justice, art supplies for creative expression, and certificates for experiences like museum memberships and cooking classes we could take together. For Emma, I'd found a beautiful edition of Maya Angelou's poetry and a journal with a lock where she could write her thoughts. For Jake, there were books about wildlife conservation and a build-your-own birdhouse kit. "Grandma Maggie, this is the best journal ever," Emma exclaimed, running her fingers over the leather cover. "I'm going to write stories about all the people we meet at the shelter." Jake was already examining the pieces of his birdhouse, his engineering mind figuring out how all the parts would fit together. "Can we put this in your backyard so the birds have somewhere warm to live?" David smiled indulgently at his children's enthusiasm, but I noticed him checking his phone repeatedly, even on Christmas morning. Sarah tried to corral the excitement, helping the kids organize their gifts and start a thank you card list. But there was an underlying tension I could feel building. We attended Christmas service at Grace Cathedral, the magnificent Gothic structure where I'd been a member for over 30 years. Reverend Williams, a thoughtful man in his 60s who'd spent years doing missionary work in Central America, gave a sermon about the true meaning of Christmas, about Mary and Joseph being refugees who couldn't find shelter, about the radical message of caring for the least among us. "The Christmas story," he said from the ornate pulpit, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling, "is ultimately about God choosing to be born among the homeless, the displaced, the powerless. It's a reminder that our salvation comes not from wealth or status, but from our willingness to open our hearts to those who have less than we do." I found myself nodding along, thinking about Maria and her children, about all the families at the shelter who were modern-day versions of Mary and Joseph, desperately seeking safe harbor in a world that too often turned them away. But I noticed David checking his phone throughout the entire service, scrolling through what looked like work emails and news headlines. Afterward, as we gathered with other parishioners for coffee and Christmas cookies in the parish hall, I overheard him talking to Tom Bradley, another father from Emma's school. "The property values in our neighborhood have been incredible," David was saying, balancing a paper cup of coffee while gesturing toward the cathedral windows. "But I'm concerned about some of the elements that have been moving into the area. There's talk of building affordable housing units near the school, and frankly, I don't think that's the kind of environment we want for our kids." Tom nodded knowingly. "I hear you. We moved to Pacific Heights specifically for the schools and the safety. If they start letting just anyone move in, it defeats the whole purpose." I felt my stomach drop as I listened to my son discuss human beings like they were unwanted insects. These were the same people I'd spent my career defending, the same people Reverend Williams had just urged us to welcome with open hearts. The final confrontation came later that evening during Christmas dinner. I'd spent hours preparing all of David's favorite foods: honey-glazed ham with a brown sugar and Dijon mustard crust, my mother's pork and chive dumplings made from a recipe passed down through 3 generations, green bean casserole with crispy onions, roasted root vegetables from my own garden, and homemade apple pie with a lattice crust that had taken me 2 hours to perfect. Sarah had brought a beautiful winter salad with pomegranate seeds and candied walnuts, and even helped Emma and Jake make hand-drawn place cards for everyone, complete with little drawings of what they were grateful for. Emma had drawn our family holding hands, while Jake had drawn the birds that visited my backyard feeder. We were midway through dinner, the dining room warm with candlelight and filled with the comfortable sounds of family conversation, when David started complaining about his latest tax bill. He'd received his property tax statement earlier that week, and the increase had apparently been weighing on his mind. "It's absolutely ridiculous how much money gets funneled into these social programs," he said, cutting into his ham with more force than necessary. 15% of my income goes to taxes, and for what? So people who refuse to work can get free housing and food stamps while I'm busting my ass to provide for my family? "Daddy," Emma said innocently, looking up from her careful arrangement of pomegranate seeds, "what are food stamps?" Before David could answer, I spoke up, trying to keep my voice level and educational. "They're help for people who need it, sweetheart. Like food assistance for families who don't have enough money for groceries, or help paying for medicine when someone gets sick." David's face immediately reddened, his jaw tightening in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of his father during our worst arguments. "It's money taken from people who work hard and given to people who've made poor choices and don't want to take responsibility for their lives." "That's not true, David," I said firmly, setting down my fork and looking directly at him. I've met these people. I work with them every week. They're working as hard as they possibly can, often multiple jobs, but the cost of living in this city has outpaced wages by such a dramatic margin that full-time work isn't enough anymore. Mom, you see the world through rose-colored glasses because you spent your entire career defending criminals and freeloaders instead of contributing something meaningful to society. The words hit me like a physical slap. I felt Sarah suck in a sharp breath, saw Emma's eyes go wide with confusion, watched Jake's lower lip start to tremble the way it did when adults raised their voices. Criminals and freeloaders? I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. I spent 40 years fighting for civil rights. I helped integrate schools in the South. I defended people facing housing discrimination. I fought for workers' rights and immigrants seeking asylum from persecution. You wasted your talent on people who didn't deserve it, David interrupted, not even bothering to look at me as he continued eating. You could have been making real money, building something substantial, instead of chasing these social justice fantasies that don't actually help anyone. Sarah looked mortified and tried to change the subject, asking Emma about her plans for winter break, but I couldn't let David's words stand unchallenged. David, everything you have came from the work I did. This house where we're sitting, your education at Stanford, your first car, the down payment on your house, the connections that got you your first job, all of that came from my wasted career defending people you now dismiss as unworthy of help. You're just being dramatic, he said dismissively, finally looking at me with an expression of mild annoyance, as if I were a child having a tantrum. This is exactly the kind of bleeding heart nonsense that's wrong with your entire generation. You grew up during the civil rights movement and think every problem can be solved by throwing money at people and making them feel sorry for themselves. Those words, "You're just being dramatic," felt like he'd reached across the table and slapped me. Here I was, trying to have a serious conversation about values and compassion, and he was dismissing my entire life's work, my deepest beliefs, my moral foundation, as nothing more than theatrical overreaction. I excused myself from the dinner table and walked slowly to my study, my hands trembling as I closed the heavy oak door behind me. The room had been my sanctuary for 40 years, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with legal texts and literature, my mahogany desk where I'd prepared countless cases, walls covered with awards and photographs documenting my career fighting for justice. There was the photo of me with Thurgood Marshall at a civil rights conference in 1985, another with Cesar Chavez during the farm workers' organizing campaign, framed newspaper clippings about landmark cases I'd won, housing discrimination suits that opened entire neighborhoods to minority families, employment discrimination cases that changed corporate hiring practices, asylum cases that saved families from persecution and death. On my desk sat a small wooden box containing letters of gratitude from former clients, families who'd become citizens, students who'd gone to college on scholarships I'd helped them secure, workers who'd won back wages, stolen by unscrupulous employers. I opened the box and pulled out a few letters, reading them through tears that blurred my vision. "Dear Mrs. Chen," one letter began, written in careful English by a Vietnamese refugee I'd helped in the 1980s. "Because of you, my children are doctors now. They help people every day because you showed us that America could be a place of justice if brave people like you fight for it." Another letter, from a family I'd helped avoid deportation. "Our son graduated from UC Berkeley this year. He wants to be a lawyer like you. He says he wants to help families like ours so they don't have to be afraid anymore." Sitting there surrounded by the evidence of my life's work, I felt like I was seeing David clearly for the first time in years. When had my compassionate child become this callous stranger? When had he decided that helping others was weakness rather than strength? Sarah knocked on the door 15 minutes later. "Margaret, can I come in?" I let her in, and she sat across from me in the leather chair where so many clients had shared their stories of struggle and hope. Her face was troubled, her usual composure shaken by the confrontation at dinner. "I'm so sorry about David," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "He gets like this sometimes, especially around the holidays. The stress from work, the pressure to maintain our lifestyle, to pay for the kids' private schools and all their activities, I think it's made him harder than he used to be." "Sarah, when did he become so callous about people who are struggling? When did he stop caring about anyone outside our immediate family?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands folded in her lap. "Honestly, I think it started when he got that senior vice president promotion last year. Suddenly, he was around all these wealthy tech executives who talk about disruption and market solutions to every social problem. They've convinced themselves that poverty is just a failure of personal responsibility, that government assistance creates dependency, that everyone could be successful if they just worked harder and made better choices." She paused, then continued. "It's like he forgot where he came from. He forgot that his success was built on your sacrifices, on programs that helped immigrant families like yours, on a society that invested in education and opportunity. Now he acts like he created everything himself through pure merit." "What would you do if you were me, Sarah?" "I honestly don't know," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "But I can tell you that Emma and Jake are watching all of this. They're learning from both of you about what kind of adults they want to become. Emma asked me last week why Daddy gets so angry when you talk about helping poor people. I didn't know what to tell her. After Sarah left, I sat alone in my study for another hour, thinking about my parents, about the sacrifices they'd made, about the America they'd believed in, a place where hard work and compassion could coexist, where success included a responsibility to lift others up. Finally, I reached for my phone and called James Morrison, who'd been handling my estate planning. For over 15 years, despite the late hour on Christmas Day, he answered on the second ring. "James, I hope I'm not disturbing your family time, but I need to see you first thing after New Year's. I want to make some major changes to my will." "Of course, Margaret. Are we talking about adjustments to existing bequests or something more substantial?" I looked out my study window at the San Francisco skyline, at the city where my parents had pursued their dreams, where I'd built my career, where my son had lost his way. Something much more substantial. I want to completely restructure how my estate will be distributed. "I see. This is in response to something specific?" "Yes. It's in response to realizing that my son has forgotten every value I tried to teach him. If he thinks helping people is a waste of time and money, then perhaps he shouldn't benefit from wealth that was earned by doing exactly that." The rest of Christmas was strained and awkward. David acted like nothing had happened, chatting enthusiastically about his work projects, the family's plans for a ski vacation in Aspen, and his ideas for renovating their Palo Alto house. But I watched him differently now, seeing the entitled attitude that had gradually replaced the compassionate child I'd raised. I noticed how he spoke to service workers, dismissive to our waiter at the restaurant where we went for Christmas brunch, impatient with the parking attendant, barely acknowledging the housekeeping staff at the hotel where they were staying. These small interactions revealed a pattern of treating people as less worthy of basic respect and courtesy. That night, as everyone was getting ready to leave, Emma hugged me extra tight, her small arms wrapping around my waist with unusual intensity. "Grandma Maggie, are you sad about something? You seem different tonight." I knelt down to her level and smoothed her dark hair, so much like mine had been at her age. Looking into her innocent eyes that still saw the world as a place where kindness mattered, I felt a surge of determination. "I'm just thinking about how to make the world a better place, sweetheart. Sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions about what's right and what's wrong. Can I help make the world better too?" "Yes," I said, meaning it with every fiber of my being. "You absolutely can, and I'm going to make sure you have every opportunity to do exactly that." 2 weeks later, I sat in James Morrison's downtown law office, reviewing documents that would fundamentally change my family's future. The 32nd floor windows offered a panoramic view of San Francisco Bay, but I was focused entirely on the papers spread across the polished conference table. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Margaret?" James asked, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he reviewed the complex legal documents. "This represents a substantial departure from your previous estate plan. Once these changes are executed, they'll be very difficult to reverse." "I've never been more certain of anything in my life, James. Instead of leaving my entire estate to David, I was creating something unprecedented in our family, the Margaret Chen Foundation for Social Justice. The foundation would receive 85% of my estate, roughly $4.5 million when everything was liquidated. The foundation's mission would continue the work I dedicated my life to, providing scholarships for first-generation college students, funding legal aid for immigrants and refugees, supporting housing assistance programs for working families, and grants for organizations fighting discrimination. The remaining 15% would be split equally between trust funds for Emma and Jake, but with very specific conditions. They would only be able to access the money when they turned 25, and only if they had spent at least 2 years in public service, teaching in underserved communities, working for nonprofit organizations, serving in the Peace Corps, or similar commitments to helping others. Additionally, they would need to write detailed essays about what they'd learned from their service and how they plan to use their inheritance to make a positive impact. David would receive nothing. "I want to include a letter explaining my decision," I told James. "Something David will read when the will is probated, so he understands exactly why I made this choice." "That's certainly your right," James said carefully. "Though I should warn you that such letters can sometimes make estate disputes more likely if the excluded party decides to contest the will. Let him try. I've spent 40 years building legal cases. I know how to create an ironclad document. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. I didn't tell anyone about the changes immediately. Instead, I began spending much more deliberate time with my grandchildren, taking them to volunteer at soup kitchens, visiting retirement homes where we read to elderly residents, and teaching them about different cultures and communities throughout our city. Emma and Jake were naturally compassionate children, and they absorbed these lessons like sponges. When we volunteered at the UCSF Children's Hospital, they brought coloring books and spent hours reading to younger patients undergoing cancer treatment. When we helped at the San Francisco Food Bank, Jake carefully stacked cans of soup while Emma wrote encouraging notes in both English and Spanish to slip into the grocery bags. "Grandma, why don't some kids have enough food?" Emma asked one Saturday afternoon as we sorted donations at the food bank warehouse. "Why don't their parents just buy more groceries?" "Because sometimes life is harder for some families than others. Sweetheart," I explained, showing her how to check expiration dates on canned goods. "Sometimes parents work very hard, but still don't earn enough money to pay for rent and food and all the things families need." "But Daddy says poor people should just work harder," Jake said matter-of-factly, his 9-year-old voice repeating words he'd heard at home. "He says that's what Grandpa and Grandma did when they came from China." I knelt down to his level, looking into his serious brown eyes. "Jake, what do you think? Have you seen the people we've helped working hard?" Howard nodded thoughtfully. "The lady at the shelter, Maria, she told us she works 3 different jobs. That seems like working really, really hard." "And what about Mr. Thompson at the nursing home?" I prompted. "The man who fought in Vietnam?" "He worked his whole life, but then got sick and lost his house," Emma chimed in. "That's not because he was lazy." These conversations gave me tremendous hope that the next generation could be different, that Emma and Jake were learning lessons about empathy and social responsibility that their father had somehow forgotten. Meanwhile, David's descent into callousness continued. At our Easter dinner, he complained extensively about a proposed ballot measure that would increase taxes on high earners to fund homeless services and mental health programs. "Why should I pay for other people's bad choices?" he argued, gesturing with his fork for emphasis. I work 60 hours a week to provide for my family. If someone chooses to do drugs or drop out of school or have children they can't afford, why is that my responsibility? Sarah tried to steer the conversation toward lighter topics, but I'd had enough. David, I need to tell you something important. The children had gone outside to hunt for Easter eggs in my garden, so we were alone in the dining room with its formal china and fresh flower arrangements, the kind of elegant setting that represented the life I'd been able to provide through my wasted career helping people. I've made significant changes to my will, I said simply. He laughed, not taking me seriously. Mom, you don't need to worry about that stuff yet. You're still healthy and sharp as ever. You'll probably outlive all of us. I'm completely serious. I've restructured my entire estate plan. The smile gradually faded from his face. What do you mean restructured? I've left the majority of my estate to charity, to a foundation that will continue the work you consider worthless, helping immigrants, providing scholarships, supporting people who are struggling. David stared at me for a long moment, his expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and growing anger. What exactly are you saying? I'm saying that money earned from a career spent helping people should continue helping people after I'm gone. Since you believe that work was meaningless, you shouldn't benefit from it. Then came the explosion I'd been expecting. You can't be serious, David shouted, his face turning red as he pushed back from the dining table. That money is rightfully mine. I'm your only child, your only heir. No, David. That money came from work you don't respect, helping people you don't think deserve it. If my career was such a waste, then the wealth it generated shouldn't benefit someone who despises everything it represented. David began pacing around my dining room, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking against the hardwood floors. This is completely insane. You're punishing me because we disagree about politics? This isn't about politics, I said calmly, remaining seated while he raged. This is about fundamental values. This is about whether you believe in lifting people up or stepping on them to get ahead. This is about whether you remember where you came from and who helped you get where you are. For the next hour and a half, David cycled through every stage of grief and manipulation. First came more anger, accusations that I was senile, that I'd been brainwashed by liberal propaganda, that I was betraying our family and everything my parents had worked for. Then came bargaining. Okay, fine. Maybe I've been too harsh about some of these social programs. Maybe we could volunteer together as a family, show the kids how to help people. Would that change your mind? David, this isn't about performative charity. This is about genuine empathy and understanding. You've called my life's work meaningless. You've described the people I've spent decades helping as criminals and freeloaders. You can't take that back with a few hours of volunteering. Next came attempts at emotional manipulation. What about Emma and Jake? You're stealing their inheritance, too. Don't you want to provide for your grandchildren? Actually, they will inherit money, but only if they demonstrate the values I tried to teach you. They'll need to spend time in service to others and prove they understand that privilege comes with responsibility. You're trying to brainwash my children, he accused. I'm trying to teach them empathy, something you've apparently forgotten how to feel. Finally, he tried threats. I'll contest this will. No court will let you give away millions to strangers while leaving your own son. Nothing. I'll prove you're not competent to make these decisions. Actually, they will uphold my wishes, I said calmly. I've been very careful about this, David. You're financially successful and don't need the money. I'm mentally competent. James had me undergo a full psychological evaluation to prevent exactly the kind of challenge you're threatening. And you've clearly and repeatedly stated your opposition to everything the foundation represents. No judge will force me to leave money to someone who finds my values repugnant. David stormed out of my house that Easter Sunday, taking Sarah and the children with him. Sarah looked back apologetically, but I could see she understood why I'd made this choice. 6 months later, I received the diagnosis that would change everything: pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The oncologist was gentle but clear. I had maybe 8 months to live, possibly less with treatment, possibly more without it. I chose to forego chemotherapy and focus on spending my remaining time meaningfully. David didn't visit me in the hospital during my 3-week stay. Sarah brought Emma and Jake when she could, sneaking them in during David's business trips. But I could see the strain this family rift had created. The children were confused and hurt, caught between loyalty to their father and love for their grandmother. Emma, now 13 and more mature beyond her years, came to see me alone one afternoon in November. She'd grown taller, her face losing some of its childish roundness, but her eyes still held the compassion I'd always seen there. "Grandma Maggie, I know about the foundation. Mom explained everything to me. What do you think about it, sweetheart? I think Daddy's being really mean to you, and I think you're trying to help people the way we always did together. I've been volunteering at the food bank every Saturday since you went into the hospital. I want to work for the foundation when I grow up, maybe be a lawyer like you." I held her hand, feeling the warmth of her young skin against my own increasingly frail fingers. "Then you understand exactly what I was trying to accomplish. Will Daddy ever forgive you?" "I don't know, Emma. But sometimes doing what's right means accepting that some people won't understand or approve. I'd rather live and die, knowing I stood up for what I believed in, than compromise my values to keep peace with someone who's forgotten his own." I passed away on a quiet Tuesday morning in October, surrounded not by family, but by the community I'd spent my life serving. Maria Santos was there, now a legal permanent resident working as a paralegal at an immigration law firm. There was Robert Kim, a former client whose discrimination case had led to company-wide policy changes. 3 of my scholarship recipients, now successful professionals, took time off work to be with me. David wasn't there. The funeral was held at Grace Cathedral, the same church where David had dismissed Reverend Williams's message about compassion just 10 months earlier. The service was standing room only. Immigrants I'd helped gain citizenship, families I'd kept from eviction, students whose college dreams I'd made possible. Emma and Jake sat in the front row with Sarah, who had quietly separated from David 2 months after my death. She'd realized that the man who could cut his dying mother out of his life was not someone she wanted influencing her children. The Margaret Chen Foundation has been operating for 5 years now. It's provided legal aid to over 2,000 immigrants, housing assistance to 500 families, and full college scholarships to 150 first-generation students. Emma volunteers there every summer and has decided to study social justice at Berkeley. Jake, now 14, tutors refugee children in English and mathematics. David? He spent more on legal fees trying to contest the will than he would have spent simply doing charitable work to change my mind while I was alive. The courts upheld every aspect of my estate plan. He lost his family, his inheritance, and his children's respect. 6 months ago, he showed up at the foundation's office, asking Sarah if there was any way he could be involved in honoring my memory. She told him he'd have to ask Emma and Jake. They were the ones in charge of that decision now. The most dramatic thing you can sometimes do is refuse to be dramatic at all. It's choosing principle over peace, values over validation. It's understanding that some bridges are worth burning if they lead to places you can no longer morally go. My parents came to America with nothing but hope. I built a career defending that hope for others. And now, even after death, that work continues. Sometimes being called dramatic is just proof that you're saying something that needs to be heard. Make sure to like this video and subscribe for more incredible true stories that will challenge everything you think you know about family, wealth, and moral courage.